Some betrayals don't come with shouting or slammed doors. Some arrive wrapped in smiles, spoken softly, and leave you standing in a room full of applause, realizing you've just been written out of your own life. My retirement party was supposed to be simple. A quiet celebration after 40 years in public service. Nothing flashy, just familiar faces, polite laughter, and a sense of closure. Felix insisted on hosting it at his house. He said it felt right. At the time, I believed him. The living room was full. Old colleagues, neighbors, a few community leaders I hadn't seen in years. There were folded chairs, paper napkins, and a banner hanging slightly crooked that read "Happy Retirement." Someone handed me flowers I was allergic to. I smiled anyway. I always had. Felix tapped his glass and stood. He looked confident, relaxed, proud. He spoke about my years of work, about dedication, about sacrifice. People nodded, some clapped early, then he said it casually, almost kindly. "We can finally begin the next chapter in our own home." The words hung there, not heavy, not sharp, just final. There was a pause, but it wasn't his. It was the room catching up. I glanced at Mara. She didn't look at me. Her hand rested lightly on Felix's arm, her eyes fixed on the floor like she'd dropped something and couldn't bring herself to pick it up. Applause followed. Cake was cut, toasts continued. Someone handed me a book about aging with grace. I heard none of it. That sentence had already done its work. My name was still on the mailbox. My shoes were still by the door. But in his voice, I understood I had already been moved out in his mind. I stayed after the guests left. I stacked chairs, gathered cups, wiped crumbs from the counter. No one stopped me. No one told me to sit down. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I felt hollow instead, like a room after the furniture's gone but before the dust settles. Later, alone in the guest room, the one they had recently started calling the future nursery, I noticed boxes stacked neatly in the corner. Labeled in black marker, "Mom's things." I didn't remember packing them. That night I didn't cry. I sat in the dark with my purse still on my lap, shoes still on my feet, replaying the sound of his voice. So calm, so sure. As if stepping aside was something I should be grateful for. By morning, I understood something clearly. When people erase you quietly, they expect you to disappear quietly too. But they never expect what happens when you choose not to beg and simply walk away instead. They thought silence would soften me, that a night alone would turn certainty into pleading. They were wrong. Morning arrived without urgency. No knocks. No gentle checking in. The house moved around me as if I were already gone. I heard cabinets open, water running, low conversation drifting from the kitchen. My name wasn't mentioned. That absence spoke louder than any argument ever could. I folded the blanket on the bed carefully, smoothing it the way I always had. Not because it mattered, but because habits don't disappear just because respect does. I packed slowly. Not everything, only what fit into 2 bags. The rest, I assumed, had already been decided for me. When I stepped into the kitchen, Felix glanced up briefly, then back to his phone. Mara smiled, polite and tight, the way people smile at someone they don't intend to inconvenience themselves for. "We'll talk later," Felix said. "Not now, not today, later." A word that asked me to wait without promising anything in return. I nodded. That surprised him. Breakfast continued. Plates clinked. Coffee brewed. I stood there holding my bag, realizing something unsettling. No one asked where I was going. They assumed I'd stay nearby. They assumed I'd cool off. They assumed I'd return to negotiate my place. I walked out without an announcement. The door closed softly behind me, no footsteps followed, no voices called my name. I waited on the porch for a moment, listening. Nothing. The house swallowed the sound of my leaving like it had practiced. Outside, the morning felt unfamiliar, quieter than expected. I sat on the bench by the bus stop, bags at my feet, watching people hurry past with purpose. No one noticed me. That too felt intentional, like the world had rehearsed this moment alongside them. I didn't know where I was going yet, only where I wasn't returning. Hours passed before my phone vibrated. One message: "You'll come back when you're ready to talk." No question mark, no concern, just certainty. I didn't respond. By evening, more messages arrived. Shorter, firmer, not apologies, reminders of family, of obligations, of how difficult I was making things. Still, I stayed silent. They weren't worried about me, they were worried about the disruption. About explaining my absence, about control slipping without resistance to justify it. I spent the night in a small room with unfamiliar walls and a lock that worked. I lay awake, not missing the house, but realizing how long I had been shrinking inside it. They had mistaken my patience for dependence. They thought removing me would weaken me. They didn't understand what happens when the quiet person finally chooses quiet on their own terms. Because when silence is no longer obedience, it becomes something far more dangerous: freedom. It wasn't the leaving that broke me, it was realizing how easily my absence was accepted. The room I stayed in smelled faintly of detergent and unfamiliar air, clean but impersonal. I sat on the edge of the bed that morning, listening to the hum of traffic outside, and tried to remember the last time I'd made a decision without checking how it would affect someone else first. My phone stayed quiet for hours. When it finally buzzed, it wasn't concern, it was instruction. A message reminding me to pick up a document I'd left behind. No greeting, no question about where I was sleeping. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, recognizing the pattern I'd lived inside for years. I had been useful, predictable, available, and now that I wasn't, my value seemed negotiable. I walked through the city slowly that afternoon, watching reflections in storefront windows. The woman staring back looked older than I felt, but lighter somehow, like something heavy had been set down without asking permission. Small memories surfaced unexpectedly: meals served at precise times, plans adjusted quietly, opinions swallowed to avoid conflict. I had told myself it was love, that compromise was strength. That keeping peace mattered more than being seen. But peace, I realized, is not the absence of tension, it's the presence of respect, and I had been living without it for a long time. When I returned briefly to the house to collect the remaining boxes, Felix wasn't home. Mara was. She stood in the doorway, arms folded loosely, watching as I packed. Her voice was calm, too calm. "This didn't have to be dramatic," she said. I almost laughed. The word dramatic used to describe silence, departure, erasure. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I carried the boxes out one by one, each trip lighter than the last. The house felt smaller now, less intimidating, like a place that had already moved on. Before I left, I looked around the living room where everything had happened. The furniture was rearranged slightly, a space cleared where my chair had been. It struck me then this hadn't been sudden, it had been planned. I returned my key without ceremony, placed it on the counter. No goodbye. Outside, the air felt different again, not relief, not grief, awareness. That night, sitting alone, I wrote down everything I remembered, not accusations, just facts, dates, Words, moments I dismissed at the time, seeing them in ink changed something. Patterns emerged. I hadn't been asked to leave because I was difficult. I'd been removed because I no longer fit the picture they wanted. And the truth settled quietly in my chest. I hadn't lost my place. It had been taken. And once I saw how intentional it was, I knew staying gone was no longer an accident, it was a decision. They expected distance to weaken me, but distance did something far more dangerous. It gave me clarity. Days passed without structure, no schedules to follow, no expectations waiting quietly in the background. At first, the freedom felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like wearing shoes that didn't belong to me yet. But slowly, the quiet stopped feeling empty and started feeling honest. I found a small place to stay, nothing permanent, nothing impressive, just a room with a window that let in afternoon light and a door I could close without asking permission. I unpacked only what I needed. The rest stayed in boxes, as if I were reminding myself that this wasn't about settling, it was about choosing. Felix finally called, not to apologize, to check timelines. "When are you planning to come back?" he asked, his voice measured, reasonable. As if my absence were a scheduling inconvenience rather than a rupture, I told him I wasn't sure. The silence on the other end was brief but telling. He recovered quickly, suggesting compromises, adjustments, boundaries that sounded generous now that I wasn't there to absorb the inconvenience. He spoke as though we were negotiating space, not dignity. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation before he finished his sentence. That night, messages followed, longer this time, carefully worded, concern mixed with subtle guilt, references to family gatherings. To how things used to be, the past was being repackaged as leverage. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on small, deliberate actions. I updated my address, redirected my mail, opened a new account in my own name. Each task felt insignificant on its own, but together they formed something solid. Independence isn't dramatic, it's administrative. I ran into an old colleague unexpectedly. She asked how retirement was treating me. I told her the truth, that it had been surprising. She laughed and invited me for coffee. No expectations, no obligations, just presence. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen without being managed. I realized then that my family wasn't confused by my silence. They were unsettled by my certainty. I wasn't asking for my place back. I wasn't negotiating conditions. I wasn't explaining myself into acceptance. I was building something separate. That was the part they hadn't planned for. They thought my absence would create a vacuum. Instead, it created a boundary, and boundaries don't shout, they hold. Because once you stop asking to belong, the power shifts, and there's no easy way to take it back. The moment they realized I wasn't coming back was the moment everything changed, and not in the way they expected. The tone of the messages shifted. No more polite suggestions, no more gentle reminders. What replaced them was urgency disguised as concern. Felix asked if I was doing okay. Mara wondered aloud whether I was being influenced. It was subtle but familiar. When control weakens, doubt becomes the tool of choice. I didn't engage. Instead, I settled into routines that belonged to me alone: morning walks, simple meals, conversations that didn't require permission or explanation. I noticed how much energy I had been spending anticipating reactions that were no longer relevant. Without that weight, even ordinary days felt lighter. Then came the visit. Felix showed up unannounced one afternoon. He stood in the doorway of my small place, eyes scanning the room, assessing not my well-being but my circumstances. He commented on the size, on the location, on how temporary it all seemed. I offered him a chair. He didn't sit. He spoke carefully, framing his concern as responsibility, about how people might talk, about family image, about how my absence was being noticed now, not missed, noticed. I listened quietly. When he finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I said something simple. "I'm not coming back." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be, they landed anyway. He laughed once, uncertain, then his expression hardened. He reminded me of everything I'd been given, everything I'd depended on. He listed sacrifices as if they were debts, generosity as if it were ownership. I thanked him for his honesty. That caught him off guard. I told him I understood now how conditional my place had been, how easily it had been reassigned once it no longer served its purpose. I said I wished him well and meant it. He left without another word. That evening the messages resumed, not from him this time but from extended family. Questions, assumptions, carefully planted narratives about misunderstanding and stubbornness. I recognized the pattern immediately. Recruit allies, apply pressure. Rewrite the story. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't defend myself. I let the silence do what explanations never could. Because silence, when chosen, forces others to sit with their version of events without interruption. And some stories don't hold up well without an audience willing to believe them. That night, I slept deeply, not because everything was resolved, but because it was no longer being negotiated. And once control slipped from their hands, they had only one option left: change the story before the truth settled in. When control is lost, the next move is always the same: rewrite the story and hope no one notices the edits. I began hearing about myself through other people. A former neighbor asked gently if I was feeling overwhelmed. A distant cousin messaged to say she hoped I was getting the help I needed. The language was careful, rehearsed, and unmistakably not mine. They weren't worried about me leaving, they were worried about what my leaving suggested. I could almost map the conversations as they happened, how my silence became confusion, how my choice became impulsiveness, how my independence was reframed as instability. It was easier to question my state of mind than to acknowledge their behavior. I let them talk. Every version of the story they shared revealed more than they realized. The urgency, the defensiveness, the need to explain my absence before anyone asked too many questions. When people feel exposed, they speak faster. Felix called again. This time his tone was softer, measured concern layered over irritation. He suggested a meeting, neutral ground, a conversation just to clear the air. I declined, not angrily, not dramatically. I told him I didn't feel the need to explain myself anymore. The pause that followed was longer than before. He hadn't expected refusal without emotion. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I almost agreed. Not because I was wrong, but because the truth was harder than pretending nothing had happened. After the call, I sat quietly and reflected on how often I had made things easier for others by making myself smaller. How many times I'd accepted discomfort to preserve harmony. I saw now that harmony built on silence is fragile and temporary. I spent the afternoon organizing old papers, letters, photos. Small records of a life that had existed before my role became background support. It reminded me that I had always been whole even when others preferred me useful. That evening, I received a message from someone unexpected. An old friend who had heard I'd moved suddenly. She asked if I was okay, not with assumptions, not with advice, just a question. I told her I was. We talked for hours, no explanations required, no justification offered. Just shared memories and quiet understanding. It struck me how different that felt, connection without conditions. The truth doesn't need defending when it's lived consistently. I realized then that I didn't need to correct the story being told about me. I only needed to live in a way that contradicted it. Time would handle the rest. And time, unlike people, doesn't rush to judgment. Because the longer I stayed steady, the harder it became for their version of events to survive unchanged. Distance doesn't blur the truth, it sharpens it until even the smallest details become impossible to ignore. With each passing week, the noise around my absence began to fade. Messages slowed. Assumptions lost momentum. The urgency they once carried softened into something quieter, resignation, perhaps. When people realize control isn't returning, they stop reaching for it so desperately. I noticed changes in myself first. I no longer flinched when my phone rang. I no longer rehearsed conversations that might never happen. The constant awareness of how I was being perceived slipped away, replaced by something steadier, self-trust. I revisited moments from the past with new eyes. Family gatherings where my opinion had been acknowledged politely and dismissed immediately after. Decisions made for my benefit without asking what I wanted. Invitations extended with conditions attached. None of it had seemed unusual at the time. It wasn't cruelty, it was convenience. I realized then that I hadn't been pushed out because I was difficult. I'd been removed because I was no longer necessary in the role they'd assigned me. My presence had been functional. My absence exposed that. Felix stopped calling altogether. When he did come up in conversation, it was always indirectly through others, through hints, through second-hand updates I hadn't asked for. He was adjusting. So were they all. I ran into Mara once, unexpectedly. She looked surprised to see me standing confidently, unbothered, unchanged. We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. She mentioned how different things felt at the house now. I told her I hoped they were well, and I meant it. The encounter confirmed what I already knew. My absence had altered the balance in ways they hadn't anticipated. When one person stops absorbing discomfort, it doesn't disappear. It redistributes. I spent more time with people who didn't expect explanations, old friends, new acquaintances, conversations that didn't circle back to obligation or history. I was learning that belonging doesn't require erasing yourself. One afternoon, I caught myself laughing freely, unexpectedly. The sound startled me, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt forgotten. That's when it became clear. I hadn't just left a house. I had stepped out of a version of myself that no longer fit. And the further I moved from it, the more obvious it became how carefully it had been constructed by others. Distance hadn't made me lonely. It had made me honest. And once the truth became that clear, there was only one thing left to decide: how fully I was willing to step into it. The hardest part wasn't leaving, it was accepting that I had stayed far longer than I ever should have. By the time months had passed, the story no longer followed me. People stopped asking questions. Assumptions faded. Life moved on the way it always does when it realizes you're no longer available to explain yourself. And so did I. I found a rhythm that felt natural, not forced. mornings that began without dread, evenings that didn't require emotional preparation. I no longer measured my worth by how useful I was to others or how quietly I could adapt. I simply existed, and that, I realized, was enough. There were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly. A familiar song, a phrase someone used to say, not painful, just present. I allowed them to pass without attaching meaning. Healing, I learned, isn't erasing the past. It's releasing its authority over your future. Felix reached out once more, briefly, politely. The message was neutral, almost formal, as if he were contacting a distant relative rather than his mother. He said he hoped I was doing well and that perhaps we could talk sometime. I read it calmly, then I placed the phone down, not out of anger, not out of fear, but because I finally understood that access to me was no longer automatic. Relationships, like homes, require mutual consent, and I was no longer willing to return to a place where my presence had been conditional. I spent more time investing in myself, learning things I'd postponed, saying yes to invitations without wondering what I was neglecting in return. I wasn't reinventing myself, I was reclaiming parts that had been quietly set aside. One afternoon, as I walked through a park filled with families, laughter echoing through the trees, I felt something unexpected: gratitude. Not for what happened, but for what it revealed. Loss has a way of clarifying truth. Being pushed out forced me to step forward. I no longer questioned whether leaving had been the right choice. The peace I carried answered that more clearly than any conversation ever could. I hadn't walked away empty-handed. I had walked away whole. And with that clarity came one final realization: this wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of one. I finally chose myself. They thought time would soften my resolve, but time did the opposite. It made it unshakable. By now, my absence was no longer a topic of concern in their world. It had been absorbed, explained away, adjusted to. People are remarkably skilled at rearranging reality when accountability becomes uncomfortable. I understood that, and for the first time, it didn't trouble me. What mattered was what had changed in mine. I noticed how confidently I moved through my days, how decisions no longer felt heavy, how I no longer waited for permission, spoken or unspoken, to take up space. Strength, I realized, doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, built through consistency rather than confrontation. Occasionally, fragments of the old narrative reached me, a relative mentioning how things were different now, a mutual acquaintance remarking that the family dynamic had shifted. I listened without curiosity, without the urge to decode what they really meant. The truth was simple. When I stopped participating in the role they'd written for me, the entire script collapsed. I was invited once to a gathering. A neutral message, casual wording, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just an assumption that time had smoothed everything over. I declined politely, not because I was holding a grudge, but because returning without truth would have meant returning without dignity. And that was something I would not compromise again. That decision surprised even me. I realized how far I'd come when saying no didn't require justification, when choosing distance felt natural rather than defensive, when my peace mattered more than preserving appearances. One evening, I sat alone with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. For the first time in years, I felt entirely present, not waiting, not bracing. Just living. I thought about the dinner that had changed everything, the moment I'd been quietly pushed aside, how small I'd felt standing there, unsure whether I was allowed to object. That version of me felt distant now. Not forgotten, but honored. She had endured long enough to make this possible. They had expected me to beg. They had expected regret. They had expected return. What they hadn't expected was acceptance, the kind that doesn't ask to be let back in. Because when you stop seeking approval from the people who diminished you, you discover a strength that no one can take away. The greatest victory isn't being welcomed back, it's realizing you no longer need the invitation. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after everything settled. There were still quiet evenings, still moments of reflection, still memories that surfaced without warning. But the difference was this. None of them made me question my worth anymore. I had learned how to sit with myself without discomfort, how to enjoy silence without filling it with explanations, how to trust my instincts without needing agreement. That kind of peace isn't dramatic, it's steady, and once you feel it, you understand how rare it is. I no longer followed updates about the family unless they reached me naturally. I didn't ask questions. I didn't seek closure. Some chapters close without conversation, and that doesn't mean they remain unfinished. It means they've been outgrown. Occasionally, I wondered if Felix ever thought about that dinner. About how casually he'd spoken, how confident he'd been that I would bend, apologize, stay. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I realized it no longer mattered. What mattered was what I had built since then. A life that didn't shrink to fit someone else's comfort. A routine that belonged to me, relationships rooted in respect instead of obligation. I had learned that love doesn't require endurance tests and family isn't defined by proximity alone. The space I once feared became my foundation. I understood now that being pushed out hadn't been a failure. It had been an invitation, just not the one they intended. An invitation to reclaim myself, to stop waiting for permission. To live with intention instead of accommodation. I didn't go back, not because I was angry, but because I was whole, and wholeness doesn't negotiate its place at the table. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been quietly dismissed, expected to beg, or pressured to accept less than you deserve, know this: walking away doesn't mean you lose. Sometimes it's the moment you finally win. Thank you for watching this video until the end. If you found value in this story, subscribe to the channel for more meaningful, real-life narratives like this. Don't forget to like the video, comment your thoughts below, and share what part of this journey stood out to you the most. Your support truly means everything, because the strongest response to being pushed aside is building a life so full, you never look back.